Welcome to Test Room, your go-to hub for professional knowledge sharing. In this video, we explore the concepts of authentication and authorization and demonstrate how to implement them effectively in Postman. This is what we are going to learn in this section. The introduction to authentication and authorization, commonly used authorization methods in Postman, deep dive into popular authorization methods, and practical demonstration and some best practices. Before we deep dive into authentication and authorization and trying to understand them better, it is essential to know the importance of authentication and authorization. Authentication is essential because it ensures that only a genuine users or systems can access sensitive data or perform certain kind of operation on this data. Authentication helps us in security, data integrity, and privacy. These are the most common aspects where authentication helps us. The security, it prevents against unauthorized access to the systems, applications, or data. Verifying identities ensure that only trusted systems or an application or an user can perform certain actions. Data integrity. Authentication helps to prevent unauthorized users from altering the data, thus ensuring its accuracy and consistency. Privacy. It helps to maintain a privacy of our users by allowing the access only to the individual who have a proper credentials. So in general, authentication and authorizations are needed to secure your transactions, thereby allowing the users to perform only the certain actions that they can perform. Let us try to understand the differences between authentication and authorization. Authentication is a process of verifying the identity of a user or a system. It basically ensures that the user or application making a request is indeed a valid user or an genuine user. For example, when you are logging into a website using your username and password, you are basically authenticating your identity. Let us come back to the APIs. In case of APIs, certain transactions are secured. That means when the client sends a request, the server validates the request and trying to understand if it is coming from a genuine client or not. If it is coming from a genuine client, then it basically processes the request and sends the services or a data back to the client. So typical example could be making a payment using a PayPal. In order to make a payment, you need to basically log in into a PayPal account using your email ID or a phone number with the valid password. Once it is successful, then the PayPal allows you to make a payment. This ensures that your payment is secured. We saw that when server receives a request from a client, it validates the authenticity of the client. Okay, and it checks whether the request coming from the valid client or not, and accordingly it grants the access or it denies the access. How does client basically sends his its credential or these details to the server? This is typically handled as part of the request header. So client sends its credential in terms of the basic username or a password or a token or an API keys as part of an API keys embedded into their request headers and to sends to the server. Server parses this part of the request header and then checks whether it is coming from the valid client or not, and accordingly it grants the access or it rejects the access. In a simple layman term, you are having an office badge to enter into your office premises. Basically the card reader checks basically who is entering into the office. So authentication is a process of verifying your identity. Now you have an access to enter into your office premises. So you can go to your workplace, you can use the cafeteria, you can use the coffee machine. But are you authorized to enter the server room? No. This brings the concept of authorization. Authorization determines what action the user or a system is allowed to perform after they have been authenticated. It specifies what resources or the data the user is allowed to access. So in summary, authentication asks you, who are you? So for example, your friend is inviting you to a home, and when you ring the doorbell, if he sees your face, then he allows you to come inside his house. And authorization answers the question, what are you allowed to do? Once you enter into his house, you can go to his kitchen, you can go to use his toilets or use his fridge and things like that. Are you allowed to enter into his bedroom? Are you allowed to see his personal laptop? This is what basically authorization means. Let's go to a Postman and see what are the type of authorization it allows. So to do this, you have to get into the one of the request, and in the request you see there is an authorization item. Click on it, and from this list you can see what are the type of authorization Postman supports. It may be no authorization, sometimes for a kind of an public API especially, you need not have to have an any kind of security in place. In such cases you can use no authorization. In some cases you follow basic authentication, which is by the username and password, then bearer token. You will have a token. It's basically a string. It's again a JWT. It's again a kind of a token. Then there is an OAuth 1 and OAuth 2. But commonly used methods are basic authorization, bearer token, and OAuth 2. So let us try to understand each one of them in detail. Basic authentication. In case of basic authentication, you will be sending a username and password as part of your request. This information will be embedded with the request header and encoded into base64 format. We will see with an example in Postman. For authentication, let us use the Postman resource called as Postman Echo. This is the link for the documentation of Postman Echo. Let us go into it. And on the right hand side, you can find a lot of the documentation for a lot of the requests. Let us go into the authentication method. One of them is basic authentication. Let's click over here. Click on this particular link. It shows the documentation for basic authentication, and this is the endpoint URL um, where you can use this as an example for doing the basic authentication. And it also says that if you don't pass any of the authentication, then if you execute this request with no authentication, it will give you a 401 error. And if you pass the username and password, then it gives you 200 OK. The username is a username and password is the password here. So let us copy this request and let us go to Postman and create a request. Let us save this request and give a new collection under a new collection as Postman Echo. Create it, give a name as Basic Auth, then save this request. Try to execute it. It says it gives a 401 because you are not passing any authorization here. It is as expected. So now let us clear the console and try to give a valid username and password via the basic authorization. The username is Postman and password is password. Now try to save this and try to execute this request. Now you see you got an you got a 200 response code and it says authenticated true. Now let us examine this particular the request, and as I already told, the client basically sends the authorization information as part of the request header. If you go under request header, there is a key called authorization, under which it says what kind of authorization you are using. It is basic here. Along with that, it is also sending a credential, your username and password, into base 64 encoded format. This is how basically the basic authentication works. As soon as the server sees this header, it passes this header and sees that it has a valid authorization, and it allows the it allows this particular request and process the request and sends the response back. This is how basic authorization works. Hope you understood. So let's talk about token based authentication. Token based authentication works by verifying user identities via using a token. Token is a string of encrypted data sent to the server by the client, such as browser or a mobile. Let us explore how it works in Postman. For a token-based authorization, we can take GitHub as an example. GitHub is a platform to where the developer can manage and track and version control his code. So I also have my own GitHub repository. GitHub basically provides an API to manage your repositories, or and to load not only manage your repository and to do lot more operations automatically. But we will only explore a few things. Just take an example for the token-based authorization. Yeah, to generate an personalized token, you have to go to your GitHub, and then you have to go to your username, under which there is a setting, and under the setting there is a developer setting, and then there is a section for generating your access token. So you can click on token classic and you can generate your own access token. I have already created an access token. I will not go and create it again. Okay, and in this on the left hand side, it gives a lot of APIs where you can perform different operations. I am basically interested in repositories, under which I am interested in listing my own repositories, right? Listing my own repositories, and there is one API for that, which is basically list the repositories for an user. I want to list all my repositories, and this is the endpoint URL I need to use, and the username is an variable here. It's a path variable. I'll take this, and it says that it basically needs an token based authorization. Let us go back to our Postman and let us create one more request, and I can give it as an colon so that it appears in my path parameter. I'll give my username. My username is vs Amanullah, and then I come to an authorization. I select token based authorization. It basically see it gives a recommendation here to use the GitHub based bearer token. Postman gives already a recommendation what kind of bearer token you will have to use, right? So I'll go to bearer token. I will just type some random thing here, okay, just for a demo, and I will try to save this as a get get repo. I try to execute this query. Let us clear all of them. Execute it. So you see you got an error as 401 unauthorized. That means you are providing a bad credential. These credentials are not valid. Okay, let us correct this. I'll come here and I will try to give a valid credential. I already stored my token in an variable. Let us try to retrieve this. See here and at the collection level I have created my already token. I give this token variable and just save this and try to execute it again. You see the success, it is now success, and it basically lists all my repositories. So for example, yeah, whatever the repository I have, it basically lists, right? So this is Jenkins demo, VSManula Jenkins demo. If I go to my own repositories and if I come here, show more, sorry. There is a one repository by name Jenkins demo. This is basically how we use token as authorization method in Postman. Hope you understood this. Let us understand the basics of OAuth 2 authentication. OAuth 2 is also similar to token based authorization. It works by verifying the user identity using a token, which is basically a token is a string of encrypted data sent to a server by the client. But in case of OAuth 2, this token is generated by an intermediate server called as an authentication server based on the client credential, which is called as client ID and client secret. This is a sequence diagram that basically explains OAuth 2 based authentication. Here, the clients request and protected resource from a server by sending a client ID and a client secret, which is basically its credentials. Then the authentication server um, verifies the authenticity of the client using the client ID and secret. If it passes, then it basically sends back the token to the client. Then client uses this token similar to the bearer token. Then it binds this token along with the request header and sends a request back to the server. And server again checks the authenticity of this token and sends the response back to the client. And one thing to remember, the token that is generated here has got a time limit. There is an expiration time that is being set uh, to the to this token. It may be in few minutes or a few hours depending upon the authentication server. This is basically how the entire OAuth2 works. Let us see how to generate an OAuth2 in Postman. There is no real example I will be showing, but I will show the parameters that is used to generate the OAuth token in Postman. Let us go to the authorization section here and let us select OAuth2, and if the token is already available, then you can pass the token. Otherwise, you can generate a token using this configuration. Here you will have to specify the name. This is just a name to understand. I can give it as generate a token for GitHub. Then it asks for what kind of credentials that you are passing. Generally, we pass a client credential, which basically consists, if I make it as a different one, then you see basically different things are coming here. But basically, I want with the client credential. In the sequence diagram, I showed with the client credential where I have an client ID and client request. So I'll have to fill the client ID and client secret, which is like an username and password. Then I'll also need to fill a kind of the URL of an authentication server. If you hover it here, it says the endpoint for an authentication server. Okay, this is an intermediate server that checks the authenticity of this client and grants a token and sends back into the client. Then you can also specify the scope, which is the scope of this particular token. Is it limited to what is the scope of this particular token? Then the client authentication. How do you want to send this authentication as part of an authorization header or as a part of the body? Once you send this basically, and yeah, this, then the authentication server generates a token. You take that token and configure here and put it here. Then if you make a request, then it basically gets you the requested resource. This is how you can configure the OAuth2 in Postman. Hope you understood this concept. That brings the end of this session. Hope you enjoyed learning about authentication and authorization in Postman. In this video, we explored why authentication is important, the difference between authentication and authorization, the some important types of authentication and authorization that we use in Postman. I also explained some of them with the real world example. If you found this session is useful to you, please support by subscribing to the channel. Thank you.